Caleb Brooks, a famous musician with a glamorous life in LA, receives an unexpected call about his father's estate in Flagstaff, his childhood hometown. A nostalgic return to his roots reunites him with Laura, his first love, who faces struggles that Caleb's fiancée, Kimberly, cannot comprehend. As Caleb rediscovers his true self and faces a choice between fame with Kimberly or genuine love with Laura, he ultimately chooses the latter, building a life of authenticity and love back home in Flagstaff. Life had been good to Caleb Brooks, or so he thought. He was a musician with a hit song that had catapulted him to fame, a fiancée who was the envy of his friends, and enough money to buy just about anything he wanted. But on a quiet evening, an unexpected phone call interrupted his routine. It was a lawyer from Flagstaff, his childhood hometown, informing him of his late father's estate. Caleb hadn't been back in years. He hadn't really thought about that life he left behind, but something about the call made him pause. His father had left behind their old house, and the lawyer needed him to make a decision about it. Caleb didn't know why, but memories began flooding back. His childhood friend, Laura, the laughter they shared, and the solemn promises they made to each other. As he stood in his luxurious living room, he felt something shift. Kimberly, his fiancée, noticed his distracted look and asked if he was all right. Caleb nodded, though he wasn't sure himself. That night, lying next to Kimberly, he couldn't shake the feeling that Flagstaff was calling him back. The next morning, Caleb mentioned the trip to Flagstaff to Kimberly, expecting her to be supportive. Instead, she barely looked up from her phone. "Why would you go back to that tiny town? You've got everything you need here in LA, she said dismissively. Caleb was taken aback. He thought she'd understand that this was about saying goodbye to his roots. But to Kimberly, it was just another inconvenience in her perfectly curated life. "It's one night," Caleb tried to explain. "I haven't been back since I left, and it's my childhood home." Kimberly rolled her eyes. "Flagstaff? There's no way I'd go there. No fancy hotels, no fine dining. It's not my style." For the first time, Caleb felt a strange disconnect with Kimberly. While she continued talking about upcoming photo shoots and brand deals, he found himself drifting back to the simple memories of Flagstaff. Maybe it was time to reconnect with his past, whether Kimberly understood it or not. As the plane touched down in Flagstaff, a wave of nostalgia hit Caleb. The small airport, the familiar scent of pine trees, the cool mountain air, all of it reminded him of who he used to be before fame and fortune changed everything. Flagstaff hadn't changed much. The streets looked the same, the mountains stood tall, and the air felt cleaner and crisper. He realized he had missed this place more than he knew. Driving to his childhood home, Caleb's mind wandered back to Laura, the girl next door who had been his best friend, his confidant, his first love. The lawyer had mentioned that the property next to his was up for sale. He wondered if Laura still lived there, or if, like him, she'd left for greener pastures. He parked in front of his old house, staring at the familiar structure. He didn't expect to feel this emotional, but here he was, standing in front of his past. As Caleb was unpacking his suitcase, a soft knock on the door startled him. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with Laura. She hadn't changed much. Same warm eyes, same gentle smile. "Caleb Brooks," she said with a laugh. "I thought you'd forgotten about us small-town folks." Caleb chuckled, feeling a strange comfort in her presence. It was like the years had melted away, and they were just two kids again, sharing secrets in the backyard. Laura invited him to a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. As they talked, Caleb realized just how much he'd missed this feeling of simplicity. Laura wasn't impressed by his fame or money. She wanted to know about him, about his life and dreams. They reminisced about their childhood, about promises they'd made and lost over the years. For the first time in a long time, Caleb felt seen for who he was, not for the image the world had created of him. That evening, as Caleb and Laura walked around the town, she showed him places they used to visit as kids. There was the tree they'd carved their initials into, the old diner they'd frequent with pocket change, the library where they'd sneak in after hours. Laura seemed genuinely happy, living a life free of the pressures Caleb was accustomed to. She spoke about her work as a veterinarian, her passion for helping animals, and her efforts to save her family's home from foreclosure. Hearing about Laura's struggles made Caleb uncomfortable, not because of her situation, but because of how different his life was now. He could buy a house without blinking, but here Laura was, working tirelessly to save hers. Caleb couldn't help but think about how Kimberly would react to all this. She wouldn't understand. She wouldn't even care. For the first time, he saw just how much he had lost by leaving Flagstaff. Over the next few days, Caleb found himself spending more and more time with Laura. She reminded him of everything he used to love: quiet moments, genuine conversations, real emotions. And the more he learned about her life, the more he admired her resilience. She hadn't had it easy, especially after her parents moved out of town, leaving her to fend for herself. But Laura wasn't bitter. She loved her work, loved her town, and was proud of who she was. One evening, as they watched the sunset over the mountains, Laura confessed how close she was to losing her home. Caleb felt a pang of guilt, realizing how different their worlds were. He could help her. He knew that, but something held him back. Maybe it was the fear of what Kimberly would say, or the guilt of walking away from his life in LA. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Caleb wondered if he could truly find happiness again in a place like Flagstaff, and if he deserved to. To Caleb's surprise, Kimberly decided to visit him in Flagstaff. She arrived with her usual entourage, bringing chaos to the quiet town. While Caleb had hoped to show her the town that shaped him, Kimberly had different ideas. She scoffed at the simple restaurants, mocked the people, and insisted on staying in a luxury hotel an hour away. The disconnect between them had never felt so clearly obvious. The final straw came when Kimberly met Laura. Dismissive and condescending, she barely acknowledged Laura's existence. When she found out Laura was struggling to keep her home, Kimberly suggested that Caleb buy the property for investment purposes. Caleb's anger simmered as he realized just how shallow Kimberly's world had become. It was in that moment he understood that his love for Laura had never faded. It had only been buried by the life he thought he wanted. Caleb was drained after Kimberly's departure back to LA. The chaos she brought with her felt like a stark reminder of everything he was trying to escape. He found solace once again in Laura's company, and that evening, they sat together on the porch of her home, overlooking the quiet landscape. Laura noticed his troubled expression, and gently nudged him to open up. He told her about his life in LA, the pressures of fame, and how empty it sometimes felt despite all the success. Laura listened without judgment, her presence grounding him in a way that felt unfamiliar and comforting. She wasn't dazzled by his fame. She simply cared about the boy she once knew. Caleb realized that while he'd achieved everything he thought he wanted, he had lost the one thing he needed the most, genuine connection. As he looked into Laura's kind eyes, he felt a surge of warmth he hadn't experienced in a long time. As they spent more time together, Caleb learned just how difficult life had been for Laura. Her family home was in foreclosure, and she was doing everything in her power to save it, working double shifts at the local veterinary clinic. Caleb admired her resilience, yet it hurt him to see someone so strong facing such hardship. Laura admitted she sometimes felt invisible, lost in a world that seemed to favor people like Kimberly over people like her. The thought weighed heavily on Caleb. He knew he had the means to help her, but he also knew that Laura wouldn't accept charity. She was proud, and he respected that. But seeing her struggle stirred something within him. He began to see the vast gulf between the life he built with Kimberly and the life he truly valued. One afternoon, Caleb invited Laura to his family's old house, suggesting they revisit some of their old haunts around town. They ended up at the old oak tree where they'd carved their initials as kids. As they laughed about their childhood antics, Caleb found himself opening up more than he'd intended. He told Laura about the pressures he faced as a musician, about how disconnected he felt from the people around him. Laura listened quietly, offering him the same unwavering support she had when they were kids. Caleb realized he was at ease with her in a way he hadn't been with anyone else, not even Kimberly. Laura's simple presence was enough to calm his restless heart. For the first time in years, Caleb felt truly seen. Back in LA, Kimberly grew impatient with Caleb's extended stay in Flagstaff. She called constantly, questioning his intentions and making demands about their upcoming wedding. When Caleb mentioned the possibility of a smaller wedding in Flagstaff, Kimberly scoffed, insisting they stick with the lavish plans she'd already arranged. It was all about the spectacle for her, and Caleb was beginning to see just how different their priorities were. The final blow came when she suggested that Caleb buy Laura's property outright, to turn it into a business opportunity. Her lack of empathy for Laura's struggle hit him hard. For the first time, Caleb questioned not just his relationship, but the entire life he'd built around people who valued appearances over substance. It was becoming painfully clear that he and Kimberly wanted very different things. As Caleb walked through Flagstaff one evening, he was hit with a revelation. He had come back to his roots to find closure, but instead, he found himself rediscovering parts of him he thought were long gone. Laura had reawakened a sense of purpose in him, a reminder of what truly mattered. Standing in front of the familiar scenes of his childhood, he realized that he had spent too long running away from the person he truly was. When he met Laura that evening, he looked at her with a newfound sense of clarity. She wasn't just his childhood friend. She was the one person who saw him for who he really was. He knew he couldn't go back to LA and pretend that none of this mattered. But the question still lingered. Was he brave enough to let go of his old life for the one he truly wanted? The days that followed were filled with tension as Caleb wrestled with his emotions. He wanted to stay with Laura, to help her save her home and rebuild their friendship. But he knew Kimberly and the life they'd built awaited him in LA. He couldn't ignore the commitment he'd made, but he also couldn't deny the deep connection he felt with Laura. In one of their late-night conversations, Laura told him that she'd been saving every penny to pay off her mortgage, yet the bank refused to give her more time. Caleb felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He wanted to offer her the money she needed, but he knew Laura would never accept it. It was in that moment he understood just how deep her pride ran, and he loved her all the more for it. Desperate to help, Caleb finally worked up the courage to offer Laura the money she needed to save her home. But Laura, true to her character, politely declined, thanking him but standing firm in her decision. "I need to do this on my own, Caleb. I appreciate your offer, but this is something I have to handle," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Caleb respected her decision, even though it pained him. He admired her strength, her resolve. Laura had always been his equal, never a damsel in distress. And now more than ever, he understood that she was the type of woman who would never compromise her principles, not even for him. With his time in Flagstaff coming to an end, Caleb knew he had to face the reality of leaving. He didn't want to say goodbye to Laura, but he also didn't want to keep her hopes up if he wasn't ready to commit fully. They shared a quiet evening together, walking through the fields where they used to play as kids. As they stood under the stars, Caleb took Laura's hand and promised he would always be there for her, no matter what. It wasn't the declaration of love he wanted to give, but it was all he could offer. Laura nodded, her heart heavy but her spirit unbroken. They both knew this was more than just a goodbye, it was a turning point in their lives. Back in LA, Caleb was met with an ultimatum. Kimberly was furious that he'd stayed in Flagstaff longer than expected, and she demanded that he choose between her and his sentimental nonsense. Caleb was taken aback. He realized that Kimberly couldn't understand the bond he had with Flagstaff, with his past, with Laura. In that moment, Caleb understood that staying with Kimberly would mean denying a part of himself forever. She didn't just want him, she wanted to mold him into someone he wasn't. And as much as he wanted to avoid conflict, he knew he couldn't keep pretending. It was time to make a choice. After a restless night, Caleb made his decision. He couldn't keep living a life that didn't align with who he was. He called Kimberly and told her the truth, that he couldn't marry her, that his heart belonged somewhere else, to someone else. Kimberly was livid, but Caleb didn't feel the sting of her words. He felt free, liberated from a future that wasn't truly his. With a renewed sense of purpose, Caleb booked a flight back to Flagstaff. This time he wasn't going back to say goodbye. He was going back to stay, to build a life with the woman who saw him for who he truly was. When Caleb arrived in Flagstaff, he went straight to Laura's house. She was shocked to see him, but her face softened when she saw the sincerity in his eyes. Caleb confessed his feelings, telling her everything he'd realized over the past few days. He didn't want fame, he didn't want the glamorous life in LA, all he wanted was to be with her. Laura listened, her heart racing. She had always loved Caleb, but she never imagined he would give up everything for her. When he finished, she took his hand and smiled, knowing that this was the start of something real, something beautiful. Caleb and Laura started their life together, building their dreams in the town they both loved. Caleb returned to music, but this time, he wrote songs that reflected his heart, his love for Laura, and his journey back to himself. The world may not have noticed his transformation, but to Caleb it didn't matter. He had found his happiness, his purpose. Laura continued her work as a veterinarian, and together, they made plans to renovate her family home. They built a life that was simple yet meaningful, a life that reflected their values and dreams. Years passed, and Caleb and Laura became inseparable, a testament to the power of love and the importance of staying true to oneself. Their love story became a quiet legend in Flagstaff, a story of two people who had rediscovered each other and found love where they least expected it. As they sat on their porch, watching the sunset over the mountains, Caleb took Laura's hand and whispered, "This is all I ever wanted." Laura smiled, knowing that they had finally found their way home,